Welcome to today's Tough Choices with Coach Catie Craig. Our world as we know it is fast changing. Parental alienation, scapegoating, rampant narcissism, broken families, global cultural disintegration. Who has the solutions? We must find them together, because together we're strong. Well, folks, welcome back to today's Tough Choices. I'm Catie Craig, your host, and today's special guest is Dr. Pat Ferris from Calgary, Alberta. Dr. Ferris has been a mental health counseling professional since 1979. And in addition to personal counseling, Pat does a significant amount of work in the area of organizational wellness. And she is an internationally recognized expert in the treatment of workplace bullying. Pat's extensive experience in counseling and consulting and mental health spans over 40 years, with an additional 25 plus years in workplace consulting, training, and coaching. Today, we will explore how bullying and mobbing behaviors, often caused by narcissistic abuse in the workplace, or just plain narcissism, cost businesses billions annually. In her article, The Roles of the Counseling Professional in Treating Targets and Perpetrators of Workplace Bullying, Pat aptly refers to narcissistic bullies as corporate hyenas and snakes in suits. In her 25 years plus involved with industrial assessments, this lady definitely knows what she is talking about. Pat, thank you for being here.
So, Catie, it's always a pleasure to talk about my work.
Well, I'm just curious, Pat. What first inspired you to write and focus about this topic? Is there a story, and why does it matter to you that you'd spend a good part of your practice in your life trying to improve these situations? Is there a backstory there?
Yeah, there usually is, and there's a backstory sort of with two streams that come together. One was long ago in the 90s, with my own experience of losing a job through a workplace bullying. In the and it always stuns me that in the counseling professionals we can be the worst to each other. But it seems to be really long ago and far away for me now. But it inspired me to try and understand, why was I so hurt? Why did it take so long to function again? So I started researching it and started coming across some of the early researchers in the, sort of in the mid 90s or so. And it was just so helpful to understand what had happened and start an understanding of why it damaged me to the point that it did. And the second stream is, I was hearing a lot of really bad mistreatment in the workplace, not so much physical, but psychological. And when I would suggest that people go to their manager or go to HR to help with some resolution of the way they were being treated, this resulted in my first paper, is that there seemed to be three kinds of organizations. One that said, suck it up, buttercup, this is the way we are. And people who worked in those organizations sort of understood it and seemed to be less damaged. They would either get fired or they'd leave, and they'd kind of move along and say, yeah, that's our organization. They're terrible. Everybody knows it. I'm not the only one that's been through this. Then there was another kind of organization that would pretend sort of to say it wasn't good. The organization that would, we have all these policies and people are most important, da, 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 then they wouldn't do anything. And that was the kind of organization in which people got hurt most, because they had that psychological contract that it was a safe place to be, and that if something happened, they would receive some support. So they not only got exposed to mistreatment, bullying at work, but they also got betrayed by their organization when they asked for help. You know, the third organization was the one that took it seriously, and of course, that was the one that had the fewest. You know, that was the one that you saw the least, that they actually really did something. And you know, that paper came out in 2004 and was a result of that time, about almost 10 years of me working in the area. And I don't think things have changed a lot. We still see those three kinds of organization, and the organization that actually will deal with stuff and take it seriously beyond their mission statements, beyond their policies, beyond all this good stuff. Still pretty rare, I think.
Well, that's a nice summation of the three different types of organizations that we might be encountering in this conversation. How are bullying behaviors different from mobbing behaviors?
Well, you're talking about two ways of defining the same behavior. Mobbing is a term that's typically been used in the UK and Europe, whereas bullying is something that sort of originated in the US and North America to describe the same kinds of behavior. We tend to look at bullying as one-on-one, and mobbing when a group of people um, mistreat one person or another group of people. So, you know, in North America, we typically use the term, well, there's a lot of terms we use, but bullying is what we typically refer to as psychological harassment or mistreatment.
In one
So you'll
article,
see them, yeah, you see them used interchangeably. You'll sometimes an organization's policy, if they have one, will distinguish that bullying is one-on-one, mobbing is a group of people. Sometimes it doesn't. Different laws, you know, our laws here are in Canada go by province. So provinces define them slightly differently, but we typically will use workplace bullying. And for my knowledge of what the few laws you do have in the US and how people in the US and writers talk about it, it's workplace bullying.
okay. I've seen in one place, I've seen it construed as terrorizing, and it's so problematic. I know I've had those experiences in the workplace, horrendous experiences, and I feel for you in the beginning when you experienced that, how long it took for to recover from that. It can be pretty bad experience. Often, I have a two-pronged question for you here. How often do you find full-blown narcissistic personality disorder anywhere along the spectrum we could look at, or in your observation, are we having a pandemic of this worldwide cross-cultural pandemic, as some experts claim, with these types of behaviors? Has it skyrocketed?
Well, in answer to your first question, you know, what is the frequency or the incidence of narcissistic personality disorder? I mean, we don't know. I mean, I see targets more than I see um, actors or the bully, because they escape notice. They don't often go into therapy or treatment. So I think the answer to that is we don't know, but what I hear from my clients increasingly are descriptions of what would fit along the lines of someone who's incredibly self-absorbed or is very well along the lines of narcissistic personality disorder. I mean, the problem with this research is organizations cannot mandate that people be tested um, unless there's significant safety risks. Or the laws just say you cannot require that kind of testing. Yeah, we can do inventories. We could, if the person is agreeable, but we just don't have it. But I would say there is a lot of research now coming out that self-absorption, entitlement, narcissism is increased worldwide. And I would suggest that I see that. I hear it from my clients when I go into organizations and do work, and people talk about what they're experiencing. It is there is a great deal of exposure to entitlement and what we might call narcissistic rage when a narcissist feels threatened and gets in a narcissistic rage. A lot of my clients are coming and reporting what would map onto that.
Okay. All right. So it's an indirect assessment of what the statistics are by the recovery numbers of those that have been affected. You wrote an article that in one article you stated that the definitions of that you just mentioned imply a power imbalance, whether it's formal as in a job position or informal as in having some form of economic, psychological, social, or status power over an individual. And we know that abuse can be severe, intentional, and driven by a need for power. How do these behaviors impact team dynamics and organizational culture when they show up?
Well, if you have a person or a team that's running on fear, um, you're never going to get any good problem solving or solutions because people will not speak up, won't say what they think. So you're not getting people's best performance or their ideas, but you're also hurting people. If people are getting raged at or put down or excluded, ostracized, any one of those things, that's some of the most painful things you can do to a human being. We tolerate physical pain or physical assault sometimes better because we're wired to be able to run, right, or whatever from that. But with psychological abuse, what's getting harmed is our sense of belonging in a group. So our basic psychological needs of a sense of belonging, a sense of being valued in a group, a sense of control over your work and your world, and distress avoidance are all being desecrated. And so when you do that, you have a severe stress response that, if prolonged, we actually do have very good statistics on this, and thank you very much to the European and Nordic countries that do this research. But there's about 9-10 times the incidence of suicide, 9 times the incidence of depression, 5 times the incidence of development of diabetes, at least 2 times the incidence of dying from a heart attack or heart problems if you're stressed at work. And to the organization, the incidence of course, the costs of funding that and the cost of turnover and reputation. So someone, and sometimes it can just be one person, through their behavior can just do immense damage to people, can kill them.
Well, our central nervous systems and our central nervous systems, autoimmune defenses, aren't they all affected? Isn't our body a system?
Yeah, and you're right. It is a system. So once the stress cycle is initiated, we're wired as human beings to have some stress, but we're also wired to get out of it, relax, go into the cave, get some love, eat, sleep, repair. So we can tolerate a certain amount of stress. Um, but when stress is constant, people try and cope, and that takes energy. And so we're coping and coping, but what's happening with our systems being exposed to all the stress hormones is that systems get damaged. It's like a toxin. Cortisol in our body is like a toxin that can chew away our nerve our nerves. The expression "my nerves are frayed" is actually pretty true. When we've been exposed to chronic stress, they actually fray at the ends. So it results in what I've just talked about. But I wrote a paper about a year and a half ago with a group of neuroscientists looking at what evidence do we have about how prolonged exposure to workplace bullying, how it impacts the structure and the function of systems in the brain. And now that we have fMRI studies, we can actually now show that how the brain function changes, but not only how it functions, that the structures within the brain get damaged, they shrink or they get enlarged or they overreact, leading to incredibly complex damage in people who've been exposed to prolonged workplace bullying.
So the plasticity of the brain, its ability to be resilient, we can, in adapting, we've seen as our stress levels raise, the brain actually changes shape.
Well, structures within the brain may change, like the hippocampus may shrink.
Yes.
It's usually a deterioration of the structure of there's new structures that can be affected. But so not just the function, but it's important that we understand that the structure can change. So that it's serious stuff. It's not just somebody being weak or whiny or exaggerating things. These are some of the most painful things you can do. And in fact, therapists that work in treating those targeted find that they experience a great deal of body pain, somatic pain. They have a lot of inflammation. And there's researchers called Naomi Eisenberger and Lindbergh who have researched this, and their hypothesis is that social pain follows very similar paths of physical pain and often triggers, because they're in similar or overlapping paths, triggers actual physical pain. And there was a clinic in Norway that simply gave people physiotherapy. Everybody listened. The people had a room to go into for 3 days. They had a significant improvement effect just through that.
It's amazing. That is very amazing. And so the same brain region that controls pain also uh, physical pain also.
They can't say it's exactly the same, but there's a lot of overlap between the social pain system and the physical pain neurons.
Some have said jokingly, well, not jokingly in this instance, that you could take an aspirin to relieve emotional pain just as you could physical pain. I've always wondered if there's any truth to that.
Well, there's some. There's some if it relieves some physical, but that's it's a band-aid solution. but I'm not going to suggest that that's the treatment at all.
No, I say that.
Bullying, but there is likely some truth to it. If you're not feeling so much physical pain, that may lead to a lessening of emotional pain. The problem becomes with workplace bullying, it's not usually a singular act that's over and done with. It's something that's ongoing that you're chronically, like it's like hitting your hand with a hammer all day, every day, and taking an aspirin to relieve the pain. Might work for a little bit, but then you hit it again. So, it's the chronicity
Yes.
of the exposure that becomes so serious. And it's the inability to remove yourself from that. A lot of people, I've heard researchers give presentations and just say, quit your job. Well, what if you're a single mom and have 3 kids, or a single dad? What if you love the work that you do, but are exposed to that bullying? You can't just quit your job to remove you from the exposure to workplace bullying.
Yeah. And this parallels the dilemma that, say, perhaps, although bullying, mobbing, narcissistic abuse is not gender specific, but it is something that is based on power dynamics. And quite often, professionals, well, paraprofessionals, want to deal with these things as though they're relational, and they just aren't.
No, I mean, power dynamics are absolutely what it's about. And, that's what makes it different from conflict. It's what makes it different from so many things, a debate. It's somehow you've lost power to disengage, for one thing, and power to be an equal partner in whatever's going on. So, power comes at many levels. It comes, at cultural levels. So in cultures where gender is a power, or religion or faith or whatever is a power, someone who's not starts in a culture without power. It comes in organizations that see power as a zero-sum game. There's only so much power and I'm going to have it. And so if you're in an organization that's competitive, um, run in the sense that power is ultimate, you're going to have this. It goes down into teams and groups and down into the individual. How do I feel powerful? What's my history? What kind of trauma have I been through? How did I get brought up? Did I have safe attachments with my parents? It can start there. So we can just go down in every level. And I mean, the worst case here is when you're in a situation where power is out of control at each of those levels and you don't feel any power yourself.
All right. Well, that would be, I imagine that would predispose certain individuals to being victims. But one of the questions that I have, as we've been talking about power dynamics, and I would propose that power dynamics uh, that are maladaptive, that are dysfunctional, would be consistent in every group setting, whether they're a family or whether they're a church or a nonprofit in the private sector. It's all going to be a wash. It's the same thing. We might want to play it down in a family situation, like, oh, it's just conflict. They aren't getting along, or any write-off that somebody wants to do in a less public structured organization such as a church. Now, I want to ask you specifically in a little while about what evidence-based solutions are applied to the workplace to handle these situations. But I'm curious, the approaches that are being used in the workplace, why do you think that some of these answers that have worked over the past few decades as research it turns out more answers that we need of how to deal with all this in organizations that cost us billions of dollars a year. Why are these applied to the family in domestic violence situations? Why don't some of these solutions effective, applied, and why don't leaders use them in private sector organizations dealing with family violence? I just don't see in my work as a coach, I don't see it being applied. It's a little bit long-winded, my question, but I'm
Yeah, so
frustrated.
yeah, so why don't agencies dealing with domestic violence apply the similar interventions that organizations do to manage it? Is that
Mhm.
what you're saying?
I think
Well,
so, yes.
off. Organizations aren't good at managing things anyways. And a lot of the research on interventions for organizations are done in contrived settings where you can't bully someone. You can't do a research study, say at a university, and go bully somebody, really. You can expose them to a bit of emotional harm and say, see, forgiveness works. And that is not the way it's going to work in an organization. But domestic violence is so taboo. At least in organizations, we've developed more laws around them. I'm proud to say that in my jurisdiction and in most jurisdictions in Canada, under occupational health and safety legislation, organizations are required to have resources for those exposed to domestic violence and to protect the workplace from domestic violence that might spill over into the workplace. We have a ton of resources for people to exit for a while, and to help them move permanently. Um, and we have a lot of therapeutic resources, but domestic violence is still something that I think people feel so shamed about that they tend not to ask for help. And it is a lot more difficult for an agency to go into someone's private life as opposed to a workplace life. You know, the question then begs, why do we have cultures that think that's okay? Why is it shameful? How do we bring people up better to be better people? How do we have early interventions for that? How do we make it okay and give the resources to seek counseling? The one of the newest things that we talk about is coercive control, which is psychological abuse, like at home. And as that concept grows and more organizations become aware of it, then I think they help educate and provide strategies to people who've experienced domestic abuse. So I don't know if that gets to your question. So ask again, or we'll probe if you like.
Um, you answered a lot of that question, and I would walk away with this that the stigma attached to domestic violence, and the underreporting, possibly the not taking psychological terrorizing in families as necessarily abuse. Instead, it's construed as relational differences and reactivity. So it can be masked, especially if it's a narcissistic, because then the narcissist is going to be able to mask their behaviors and blame the victim. So we have kind of a bit of a muddle at this point that
But there are, I have a couple of clients right now who are experiencing, what they believe. They've described to me and done some online inventories around, narcissistic abuse. They're engaged in courses and discussion groups and education groups that help them understand what it is and how to deal with it. So I think we've come quite a ways now in recognizing coercive control, narcissistic abuse, and providing, there are more and more resources that will help people identify. And I think understanding and identifying what's happening to you is critical, because it takes it away from you as there's something wrong with me. Yeah. And it makes it easier to seek help and to talk about.
Being identified more recently, yes. There's tons of information about it. And I think probably the core of my question is, and this is probably going to happen more in the future, is they find answers in formal settings like organizations. There's so much with evidence-based research on how to manage the behavior of narcissistic abusers in the workplace, even sometimes outwardly applying pressure and various caveats to someone that has been clearly identified with narcissistic behaviors, whether it's just narcissism or it's actually a full-blown personality disorder. But I know in our prior conversation, we were discussing how behaviors can change. The core of the person may never change, but the behaviors can be managed. Would you like to elaborate on that just a little bit?
In the workplace or domestically? I do want to make one
Just go
comment
ahead.
sort of on a previous line of discussion.
Okay.
I had just a wonderful colleague from Paris, Hirigoyen, Marie-France Hirigoyen, that wrote a book called Healing the Wounded Soul. And she had done a lot of work in domestic abuse and was relating the wounding of bullying to domestic abuse. So some of the stuff that's come into the workplace has actually come from some of the research on domestic abuse. So, perhaps we can leave it with they can inform each other, and we have to be aware that psychological abuse, whether it's in a personal life, a relationship, a home setting, a school, or in the workplace, we know that it damages and hurts and injures people severely. And we know that there has to be intervention to help all parties, not just the target, but the people who are acting in ways that will have a massive effect on their life. Ultimately, we need to help them. They may not be receptive, but resources need to be there. So, sorry, the second part was help me out again. I got off on my tangent there.
Well, you're not the only one. I'm going off on a tangent too, something that's very close to home. Um, and you may have answered it, because the information that's being uh, gathered from both sectors is valuable to each other, but we're dealing with two different animals, two different populations, or two different settings, I should say, not necessarily populations, because if a person's narcissistic, it's going to bleed over from work to home, because it's a power dynamic. And these generally are indicative of shame-based people that put forth a front and operate by keeping control and in power of everything in their lives and the people around them so they can be safe. Is that correct? Pretty much. A narcissist is a shame-based person and needs control to feel secure.
No, there's narcissism has been described in all sorts of ways. Um, we often see it as someone uh, with a big ego but fragile. But we can look at, a shame-based one is often somebody who was brought up um, never have a sense of personal um, competence. Somebody spoiled, always done for, and they may feel easily threatened. Others may have been a lonely, invisible child that got that got rewarded by love, and they need love. But I think ultimately the understanding of a narcissist is that in some ways their ego is very big, but inward is quite fragile. It can be shame, it can be need for love, it can be need for power, it can be a lot, but it's very fragile, and it's easy to trigger defense in them. And a narcissist, typically will come out with, I am special, I am, and will punish. They can have a narcissistic rage. Um, and this is on what my clients report to me, is this exposure to this rage that comes out if you've triggered them in any way. And it's often very hard to know what's going to trigger them. You may think you're just sharing an idea. If you're competent, what I find for my bulk of my clients that come to me experiencing workplace bullying, they're very competent in what they do. They're very conscientious. They work really hard. They have a strong belief in rules and order and a just world, and they don't go into work to play politics. So they're often unaware of sort of the political surroundings, and that almost makes a perfect target, because if you're a leader or a coworker and you have a big ego and need to be recognized, and somebody's being like that over there, um, you're going to get really triggered, and you're going to come out to hurt and harm them, so that they're out of so that you don't feel so anxious. You don't want them around you. So those are the two main things, is that really good, smart, conscientious, competent people will trigger someone who inside isn't, without knowing it and without being aware, usually in the beginning of what's happening, until it's too late or quite a long ways down the road. And that, I think, you'll see in a relationship. The love, the attraction, the hormones that flow when you first meet, bind us to who you really are, to what's really going on. And we're truly blinded. Um, and you may go a long ways down the road in a relationship with a narcissist, until you understand what's happening.
So with the I know there's different types of narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder, and different origins, different reasons that they become that way, and there's the spectrum of abuse and all that. Um, so the power dynamics and the false front that true narcissists employ to either in dating or in the workplace. We're going to see that facade, very strong, that strong, charming personality. They're going to show up in that manner in either application. So speaking of showing up, uh, what are they using? In my research over the last few years on this topic, I've seen screening tools that can kind of spot potential narcissistic behavior or attitudes up front. What are they? Have they improved? And what are the key indicators that these tools analyze to screen out these individuals before they ever become a problem?
Well, we can talk about tools and inventories that are designed sort of not from deep research, but to help people understand. And I think, so I think we're generally talking about um, a lot of tools that people would use that are not psychometrically researched. Maybe some of them are, but those would be clinical tools that a clinician might use. So I think we have to, you have to be careful when you're talking about tools and inventories. But having said that, I think it's really important that people understand sort of what might be if you're feeling something's going on in your relationship, you're feeling attacked, you're feeling put down, sometimes you feel really loved, it feels wonderful, and other times it just feels awful and you're not understanding what's going on, then I do think inventories are really helpful to give people some idea about what might be going on. So we have some good ones on coercive control, maybe a narcissist, it may be someone else. We have the narcissistic personality inventory that people can complete to look at where along the lines they are. There's a book that I often recommend to people, and I'm just going to hold it up. Can you see that? It's Disarming the Narcissist by Wendy Bahari. And I'll just go to a page here that gives 13. You may or may not see the whole thing, but she gives is the difficult person in your life a narcissist? And there's 13 questions. And she says if you get, let's see, I think it was 11, yeah, at least 10 of the 13 traits, the difficult person in your life most likely meets the criteria for maladaptive narcissism. And that's a really important thing, either in the workplace or in a personal relationship, to get some awareness of this might be happening. Because then, if you're meeting that criteria, because it's pretty strict, you only have to miss 3, that it gives someone an idea of, I might need to check this out. And that's a red flag to go to a therapist, to go and say, to talk to someone about what might be going on, how do I handle it, how do I talk about this with my partner or the person involved, but I think people need to go talk with a professional because particularly in the workplace, the person I described as the competent, conscientious, rule-oriented person will often go, and this is often in a relationship too, will often go with the idea that they can talk to a narcissist rationally, that that you can say, this bothers me, this hurts me when you behave like that you can confront them. You can't. They don't respond well to that. And that's one of the marks of somebody who's far along the narcissistic line, is when you try and talk to them rationally, they're threatened and don't engage, and they'll darvo you, put you down, get you over there. That you can't count on them to change. That's another thing, is organizations have probably more power than someone in a relationship does to demand different behavior. Because you can fire someone. Sure, you can divorce someone, but that's not as easy as firing someone or getting them into a coaching process. Nor do some people don't want to do that, at least at the beginning. So a lot of the beliefs that we have about most people, about we can talk to them rationally, people are capable of change, that will achieve justice for things that happen to us in life, don't hold true for a narcissist. And so those are other flags, both personally and organizationally, is if you're in a relationship where you can't do that, something not good's going on.
And I think there's so many directions I could head, and this is relational narcissistic behaviors and problems are my passion. So I won't follow the temptation to go down that trail too much, but I do have a question. Would you recommend today, because of the prevalence in this narcissistic the culture that we have, that individuals who are maybe getting married go into it with a prenuptial agreement to protect themselves if their lover turns out to be a not lover?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would recommend that, regard of anything, we're not in the 50s, we're not in the, times have changed. Uh, and times are complex. Relationships, marriages break up at quite an alarming rate. So, and I think it's just really important for people to be able to talk about, what are we responsible for? What happens if we break up? I think I would recommend, when you're entering into either a live-in or agreement, or you're getting married, go access some counseling, not because something's wrong, but to explore and grow and understand where you are, that you can come out with an agreement. I wish I could say the same about the workplace. I mean, we do have contracts in the workplace, and in most jurisdictions, the workplace is legally accountable for a psychologically safe. That's the contract. But sadly, they don't often honor the contract, and even more sadly, when people try and achieve justice through um, organizational policy or for laws, it's often not achievable, and it can it can ruin a life. I've seen many people never get out of the search for justice and never be able to accept that justice wasn't provided. And that is the tremendous power that an organization has, or our societies and laws have, to ruin a life and damage a person. I just wish it wouldn't get to that point. I wish that organizations would be able to informally manage things before it gets outside of them. And the same in a relationship. I wish that people could go get the help and do what they need to deal with something before it damages the relationship or a person.
So, from any vantage, in this culture today, and there is a definite difference between narcissistic personality disorders. All the personality disorders, most of them are damaging to others. And don't most personality disorders, but especially narcissistic personality disorder, have a degree of sadism in them? Would you say that
Oh,
this is
yeah.
something I read, but
Narcissistic personality disorder, psychopathic, sociopathic, however you want to define it, have a degree of willingness to harm. The psychopath does it because sometimes it's fun. They can. Their brain's just not working in the way other brains in the limbic system inside work. But a narcissist will harm out of defense, and out of ego. I can give the gift of being kind and nice, or I get to punish. So yeah, those two, and narcissistic personality disorder, would have a propensity to feel entitled to hurt.
so abusers grow up to be abusers or to not be abusers. But every person that's been abused has a choice to make when they come out of the power dynamics that they've been in, be it as a child, a teenager, or a work situation. It can either feed an ego, and that person can go on and say, no, I'm going to do it to somebody else because it was done to me, or not. But
Yeah.
according to your article on dealing with allegations of bullying and mobbing at the organizational level, there's a concept called reasonable person that's been applied. What makes a victim's claims credible enough to be substantiated?
Well, you've brought up the Canadian way of law, which is based on the English old law. Is that a reasonable person ought to know? Um, and so in defining what a reasonable person is, we have several different laws that deal with um, reasonable person and harmful behavior. One is protected grounds, race, gender. I mean, we've got about 15 in Alberta. And the other is through occupational health and safety legislation, about not about behavior not based on protected grounds. So organizations are required to train people on what a reasonable person is. So, what is discrimination? What is psychological harassment? The training provides all sorts of examples and case studies around what constitutes it. And then further laws, case law defines it. So we recently had a judge rule on a tort or civil law for harassment. And now it set the standard for if you go through civil court, what you have to prove, what would be a reasonable person, what you have to prove um, to sue. So the short answer is research and case law have defined what actions go beyond the boundaries of what a reasonable person would experience as harassment or discrimination. And most laws, case laws, including the US, are very much based on defining where the boundaries are. So, some countries are a lot further along the way in terms of workplace harassment and bullying than perhaps the US is. Nordic countries, Germany, Canada has come a long way in the last decade, have laws. And the United States now is faced with, individual states taking it seriously enough to implement on psychological harassment.
That's really good news.
Yeah,
I know.
there's many institutions in the U.S. The Workplace Bullying Institute. I should name some more, but there's very good and big institutions working very hard to bring legislation in.
Well, okay, so we've talked about victims. What are some of interventions or support systems that can help employees affected by bullying or mobbing? Someone out there is listening to this and saying, how can I help those that have been affected in my organization to heal and to stay with my organization because something got past me as the leader here? What would you say is an appropriate instrument that might be put in place or has been put in place?
Well, the most important thing is to validate to the person that something happened. Okay, maybe I think there needs to be informal ways. So I would say it needs to be safe for someone to come to a leader and say, I'm experiencing something in a relationship with my colleague or even you, that doesn't feel good to me. That feels harmful, and this is what's happening. So if it's a leader, how can they help? They can walk around and observe. And if they observe people behaving badly, you step in and say, I just witnessed what you said and did to employee X, and that was offensive to me. I didn't, so take them aside, coach them, step in the moment if you want, and say, hey, that's a little bit over the line. So be present as a leader, be aware that these dynamics can happen, step in, watch. You can provide training, you can provide discussions. You need to, if you know someone's been damaged and hurt, offer them resources like counseling. Maybe you do some training. And if it's a whole team that's been damaged, you offer some debriefing and working on rebuilding trust. So it's about, you know, people misbehave. We're going to see this behavior. There is no place that's never going to have it. But as a leader, you need to be aware of your own behavior. So you need some counseling and coaching. I mean, I once heard a vice president of a very large oil and gas company, you know, talking about, they were asking what had made her successful. And she said, understanding how I work with people, but understanding myself. So I want you all to know that I go to counseling and I've taken all sorts of tests to understand myself and to work on myself. I thought that was an amazingly powerful thing. So in a world where entitlement and narcissism are objectively growing, the research tells us that, the antidote to that is creating a world or a group of belonging and compassion. If you want just two basic things, how do I create belonging? I create belonging by sharing and talking, uh, having lunches, being present, being around. I create compassion by talking to people, knowing them. Um, I create a world where it's safe to be at work. We talk about real things. You know, I just the other day was working with a group of a team at a technological institute around, I feel respected when, to ask those questions. And the discussion just went on for an hour. I did the same with a civic employer. And we talked about, I feel respected when. And my goodness, the discussion that came up was amazing. It doesn't take a lot at a team meeting to have a safety moment to say, yeah, how do we feel respected? Let's just talk about the moment. If you do those things, you're not likely to have to do an investigation or go legal. And it's not that hard if we really believe in what it means to be human. And I think, you know, if I'm going to wind up anything in my talk today about the importance of being human and giving all humans decency and respect, of creating a positive belonging without exclusion, to have compassion for one another. Uh, if we can move along those paths, we get off the paths of narcissism and entitlement, and cruelty and meanness, divisiveness, and power as a zero-sum game. Power can be shared, and when power is shared, it becomes more powerful. I don't know.
Thank you,
That's
Pat.
my
That's
thought.
that's so powerful. And as we're winding down here, I thank you for that. I know that in the investigative phase of finding out through interviews and polls in an organization if this type of thing is going on more indirectly than confrontationally, uh, there's there's some powerful ways to find what's
It's
that.
important. It's important, but it's just one data point. Okay. You need a lot of data points to really understand. And the biggest data point is you knowing who your people are. I'm not saying don't do it, because I think you should. But I also want to say, I often have people come and say to me, this doesn't feel like it maps on to what I'm experiencing. And I've worked with groups who were so terrified of their leader that in completing those kinds of anonymous, confidential processes, that every one person came to me once and said, well, we did a leadership review of somebody that people were saying was bullying, and we got this thing back, and it was great because the average, it met the average, the middle thing. And I said, but oh, that is just every single person on every single question rated it as a 3 out of 5. Now there's a terrified group. That was not that it was not valid. Okay. People were too afraid to even confidentially and anonymously report. So it's a data point. And if it's a broader data point across an organization, everything gets mushed together into averages. You still got to know what's going on with your people. And if there's been terror by a person or by you, people are not going to speak up. So, again, you come from a point of curiosity, of invitation, of creating belonging and having courageous conversations. People can do that if they feel safe. And so it's about keeping the discussion open, having informal ways, having the attitude, I want to help as a leader. So if you do nothing else, that will have an impact.
Oh, wow. That's saying a mouthful.
Yeah.
And those and basic humanity, basic old-fashioned interactions that involve character and caring is super important here. Um,
And
I'm
the capacity, when we create good belonging and compassion, there is forgiveness for what I will call slips, trips, and spills of civility and even going over the line. I mean, I'm not going to say I've never gone over the line. I know I have. I've been told I have. I've apologized and worked hard to be better and different. So when we can come from that, it isn't about being perfect. It isn't about being soft. It isn't about hard conversations. But it is about working together towards being the best group team that you can be. So,
well, I'm going to ask you one or two more questions, and then we're going to end. Thank you for that answer. In evidence-based research, there's been some discussion that narcissistic employees, either on the lower end of the spectrum, not the psychopathic social, not on the higher hardened end, but maybe more malleable narcissists that aren't, so cut and dried.
or there's
Uh,
traits,
and,
but traits,
okay, so right, so with
but
traits, not narcissism, but narcissistic traits. Okay, well, let's say that. That organizations uh, determined to work at this problem employee, that if they work together, there are some applications that can be uh, employed in organizational applications, strategies that can be employed to give incentive to a strong narcissistic leader to curb their behaviors. Can you maybe suggest something for those who are wondering what can be done to an employee they want to keep?
again, if it's a leader, there's a leader above, and that leader above needs to be aware of what's going on, needs to understand, and that's hard because the leader reporting to his or her leader is not going to be honest. But shall we say that it's been identified that someone has been behaving in entitled manner, has been having rages or singling people out, hurting them because they're defensive. The first start is a performance-based conversation. Is that we expect you to treat your people with dignity and respect. And I've witnessed you, or I've heard from people that here's some of the kinds of behaviors that you're in, and we need you to stop that. So this is our first performance conversation. At that point, you may say, we'd like you to attend some coaching. This is where something like the boss whispering process would be very helpful. But there needs to be accountability and follow-up. You don't just leave it. People need to know that if they continue their behavior, it will continue as a performance management issue that could ultimately result in discipline or severance. You don't start there, but people need to understand that the organization is serious, that if you want to succeed here, that you'll change your behavior and that we want you to succeed. There's lots of things that you do that are of value to us, and we want you to be here and be a successful person. So it's feeding some of that ego, not getting into too much of the defense, but also setting a line that says, this cannot go on, and it can't go on for you and your success in this organization. So those are your your biggest leverage points, are the discussions, the requirements, the expectations, but also the ability to provide resources for them to help change, to say that, all of us struggle with some of our behavior, and this seems to be a struggle for you. We'd like to help you with it. Would you be willing to go through a coaching process and get them into that? Training for managers, supplying training that looks at how do we manage people in a way, and what do we expect as our company, and how you manage people. Having people have access to inventories. I do a fair bit of testing for promotions using a Hogan system. That it's a system of motivation, values, and personality, and people get a report that they go through me with that identifies, here's where your strengths are, here's where some challenges are for you, here's sort of a year's kind of plan to deal with it. And they engage in a process of that. And, most people that go through that say, wow, that really helped. So there's lots to be positive about helping people be the best that they can be.
Well, thank you for that. So incentives, a little bit of ego stroking, and acceptance, and giving them a sense of belonging, that, you know what, you're not necessarily a bad person, but these bad behaviors have got to be brought under control.
These are behaviors that are not effective, and don't fit with how we behave in this organization. So, be proactive. Start with how you select people in, that they have to be a team player. If they're going to be in a team setting, they need to be a team player. So there's lots of questions you can ask around experiences in team and how would you be a team player. There's some inventories that you can use for selection processes. That's why you engage an industrial organizational psychologist who can do those sorts of things for you. You give people training on how to be a good person, how to be a good leader. You give them access to insights, personal insights for themselves. So you set it all up. You give them maybe immediate coaching. Some organizations do that. You give them lots of monitoring and mentoring. You give them mentors to help. These are all stuff that are just broad-based proactive things, and you deal with things early. You watch, you witness, you listen, you step in, and you deal with behaviors before they get out of control. Because dealing with them at the other end is very unpleasant and not very effective. And so those with traits, of any sort of traits, we all got traits, and we all, that's workable, very workable.
People with narcissism that are just plain selfish and egocentric can be dealt with. People with a personality disorder that are habitually employing these traits to control, manipulate, and hurt other people are different. But either way, some of the routine approaches at the beginning can salvage an employee before it becomes crucial to make a decision about that employee. Now, thank you for that. I have to ask one last question. And this is about religious organizations. Because I do run across people from church that are religious that have been damaged by religious organizations. What are the dynamics in religious organizations that you've observed over the years that encourage or discourage the dealing with individuals? What what dynamics cause these leaders, pastors, leaders in the church to either embrace and deal with these issues or not? What is your experience? And do you work with these organizations, religious?
I see a lot of people from those organizations, and that is a stream of research in the workplace bullying field is workplace, and I've seen a number of churches really taken to task over what the congregation members or volunteer pastors or helpers have been through. So it's real. But, if you talk about power, most faith organizations are very power based. That a minister, a pastor, a bishop, um, whatever it is that's at the top of your faith hierarchy is usually hierarchical. So that looks at power as zero sum. So quite often, those who lead faiths and churches have been brought up and gone through a system where they feel they have power, that they can vehemently protect the any challenge to the way the faith is thought about. So they become rigid in their thinking, rigid in how they run their organization. And so, again, like any other organization, it's really critical to look at how do we create true belonging, how do we create true compassion, how do we listen to ideas without being threatened, how do we have good discord, how do we disagree respectfully, where the lines are, and that's an accountability for people who belong to churches and run not churches but mosques and temples and whatever you want to of all the faiths in the world.
Well, these are the intangibles. These are the spiritual, foundational uh, uh, things that uh, underlie any culture or civilization. We are spiritual creatures to some extent. And spiritual organizations, sometimes they operate on a different premise than structured, concrete organizations. But what you're saying is the same rules apply. Treat people like human beings and don't come at it from a top-down approach. Be humble and be willing to deal with these things as a human being talking to other human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. And isn't that what a faith is typically about? Belonging and compassion and a belief in humanity. So don't forget that.
Yes, yes. And sometimes I think when we're walking in pride and ego, we become blind to the most important things, don't we?
Yes.
And then,
Well,
yeah, that's sad. But so what would you say to a church leader who has encountered an abusive situation going on, say a husband who is systematically terrorizing his family and his children? What advice would you give to a church leader as far as a procedure that they could follow? And what do you expect would be a hindrance or hindrances for them uh, in dealing with these situations?
well, I would hope at a basic level they would. I don't know how they got the information, but might be from one partner sharing it. So, the leader could ask the person who shared the information, would you be okay if I approached, um, your partner. I'm just going to use the word partner so that I don't use he, she, they, but we'll just use the word partner. Um, if they're part of a faith and the leader of a faith has a gentle and I've discussion, if the other partner is willing, that would be a wonderful start. I mean, we're all responsible that if there's violence, we've been that towards children, then we need to report, so that is hopefully we're not talking about something across that line because they have an ability to report. But the same thing would apply. Could you give a sermon on it? Could you give some resources to the partner that's coming to you and talking? Because you need permission, and you need to be really aware of, if you go and talk to someone else, saying, I've heard that these issues are going on in your home, what kind of dynamic might emerge from that. But hearing something about violence, there is an obligation to deal with it. So if I would just say, you need to be aware of your duty as not just within your faith, but your duty within the law to report and get supports in. So what can you do? You can provide resources and ideas and support to the person that may be sharing that with you. You can ask permission. You could say, would you ask your partner, would you come in and just talk, and let's talk about in a faith, what a relationship looks like. So yeah, to be very aware of your obligations legally, to protect, to be aware of confidentiality, and to hope that whatever faith you have has resources either within the church to lead people to for counseling and coaching, develop men's group, develop women's group, have groups in your church where you can talk about things. Again, be present. It's the same set of recommendations really that I would have. And just to say that while churches are supposed to be while faiths are supposed to be safe, and that they have the same accountability for belonging and compassion and managing human behavior as any other organization does, profit, nonprofit, private, public, faith-based, not faith-based.
Well, given the fact that our spiritual organizations were, and to some degree now still are, the foundations, the pillars upon which our civilization is built, we have moral obligations to, I would think, to set structures in place, knowing that there is a prevalence, an increasing prevalence of abuse in the home and in the workplace. So what I'm hearing you say is that it would be a wise leader who would anticipate problems, and not because it's the right thing to do, but because of personal conscience, put something in place that can anticipate having to deal with these issues, exercise foresight, rather than have it be a matter of hindsight at the end.
Well, I certainly would agree. That could take us long into the idea of moral distress and moral outrage and moral injury, of which now the concept is not just of moral injury, is not just related to military service, but to moral injury of all kinds. And that is, if we leave it on, for everybody, the moral injury of being degraded as a human being, of being injured and hurt and excluded, ostracized, physically, verbally hurt, um, gets to the core of what it means to be human and gets to the core of a moral center. And I would hope that not just faith and churches, but more people will that will turn around from this entitled, abusive, narcissistic trend that is being identified, and hope that we're at peak of it and turn around to some reflection on our moral obligation as human beings, not just our obligation, but our moral compassion, to get to what it means to be human in the world today and how we go forward without so much destruction.
We are encountering more and more dark places in the landscape of our lives now. Thank you for that admonition and encouragement. Yeah,
I completed the course in treating moral injury about a year ago with the Veterans Administration in the U.S. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful course that reminded me of the importance of caring for those who've been morally injured and hurt, of compassion, and reminding ourselves we're all vulnerable to it. Sometime in our life, we're going to experience it. So let's work better at the prevention end.
True words, definitely true words then to wrap things up with. I want to thank you for your observations and your insights and information that will definitely help folks and touch lives in all different sectors as we've covered. Is there anything you hope readers will take away from your work and its implications for workplace dynamics? Is there anything you want to add to all these important things that you've already said?
I just want to say I think we can do it. I think organizations have good people. My hope is that, right now we're in a legal context where everybody's getting laws and policies, which is good, but we have to all remember that we're human, we make mistakes, and that if we start early and can just learn to be respectful, but also understand that we are human, we make mistakes, that some forgiveness at lower ends is helpful, and that as organizations, build them well. Design good jobs that, based on our research, reasonable demand, some control, support, work towards belonging and compassion. And if you do that, every little step you take will have an effect.
Things that make us human, right?
Yeah.
Yes, that our needs, the basic needs that we all have, knowing that someday, if we ignore a dilemma that someone else has, we may find ourselves in that dilemma. Again, Dr. Ferris.
Anyways.
Again, Dr. Ferris from Calgary, Alberta. You are available for organizations who find themselves dealing with these very dilemmas that we've been discussing. Dr. Ferris is internationally known for her work as an effective interventionist in these types of problems. Feel free to give her a call. I'm sure she'd love to hear from you. And also,
wishes to everyone out there for the best way forward with your workplaces, your relationships, your country. I wish all the best.
Thank you, Dr. Ferris. Would you like to give folks your website and your email if they feel the need to contact you besides calling you?
Yeah. My website is simple, patferris.com. Ferris, patferris.com. My email is pat@patferris.com.
Well, and that is definitely easy to remember.
And thank you for the pleasure of talking, Catie. It's been wonderful.
Well, I feel just very honored to have had you on this program. And today, as we wrap things up on today's Tough Choices, I'm your host, Catie Craig. Thank you for staying with us. Thank you for paying attention to this very valuable topic. Don't forget that unless you put something into action, you don't own it. So take this hour of your life, or this hour or so that you have sat here listening to our discussion. If you take one thing away and own it and put it into practice that will benefit you and those around you, you have definitely spent 1 hour of your life in a worthwhile application. Until next time, this is Catie Craig saying goodbye.